How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Lamed Tes, Daf 39 of Masechtas Zevachim. Friends, on Daf Lamed Tes of Masechtas Zevachim there are three sections. The first section discusses the final three blood applications of a korban chatas, specifically a korban chatas hachitzon, a korban chatas whose blood is thrown on the outer mizbeach in the heichal, in the azara, as opposed to, of course, a chatas apnimis, whose blood is thrown on the mizbeach apnimi in the heichal, which actually we're going to get to at the end of today's daf. However, the first section of today's daf, we are still discussing the chatas achitzon, the chatas whose blood is thrown on the mizbeach achitzon in the azara. We've discussed over the past few days that, at least according to Beis Hillel, when it comes to a chatas achitzon, the four applications of blood on the four horns of the mizbeach achitzon, right? I.e., when you go to the top of the mizbeach, there are those four cubes in each corner. So the blood of a korban chatas achitzon is applied to each of the four horns of the mizbeach ha-chitzon, and we've said over the past few days that according to Beis Hillel, really all you technically need to do is apply the blood. The kohen needs to apply the blood to one of the four kranos, i.e., once the blood has been applied to one of the four of the kranot, of these horns of the mizbeach ha-chitzon, at that point, it's already considered kervu kol matirav, i.e., at that point, the meat can be eaten by the kohanim, the emurin can be burnt on the mizbeach. However, nonetheless, there are, of course, four applications of the blood, and we still do apply all four applications. Today, we are going to be discussing the final three applications of the four blood, the ones that are not ma'akev, the ones that you need to do, but if you don't do them, you would technically still be the korban would still be kosher. We're going to be discussing those three applications in the first section of today's daf. How do we kind of relate to those three, which aren't, I guess, technically speaking, needed, but we still need to do them. So how do we relate to them? That's the first section of Daf Lamed Tes of Masechta Zevachim. The second section is discussing sacrifice blood on a kohen's clothing. One of the things that we will be discussing about the last three applications of the blood of korban chatas is, what if it splatters onto the clothing of the kohen? Does he need to wash his clothing, or does he not need to wash his clothing? That is the second section. And finally, the third section is that we begin to discuss the blood of a chatas apnimi, of an internal chatas. And the halacha by a chatas apnimi is that all four applications of blood on the mizbeach apnimi are ma'akev. You gotta do all four, and we will be discussing that. So friends, this is what we have in store for Daf Lamed Tes of Masechta Zevachim. Here we go. All right, friends, we are going to begin on Daf Lamed Ches Amid Beis, about halfway through the Amid at the two dots. So we have some work to do on Daf Lamed Ches Amid Beis. However, Daf Lamed Tes Amid Beis is actually pretty short, so hopefully that will kind of balance out. Okay, so we are going to begin on Daf Lamed Ches Amid Beis at the two dots, about halfway through the Amid. Omar Reb Yochanan. Says Reb Yochanan, Sholish matonis shebechatos. So regarding the three final, right, the three, what did I call them here? The final three blood applications of the korban chatas, right? So as I said in the introduction, of course, by chatas achitzonis. So of the four applications of the blood, the first one is the one that is required. The other three, you need to do them, but if you don't, the korban is still kosher. So regarding those three, which aren't technically needed, so to speak, so says Rabbi Yochanan, Einon ba'os balayla, you cannot apply them at night. Uvos la'achar misa, this is an interesting one. They can be applied after misa. Who can tell me what this means? What this means is that we've learned on a few occasions that there's a concept of chamisha chatos mesos, that there are four kinds of korban chatases that we simply let die, that we basically starve them to death. one of them is chatas shemesu b'aleh. If a person sets aside an animal to be a korban chatas, and the owner dies, so this korban chatas we basically just leave to die. That is one of the chatos shemesos. Now, what happens if you have a korban chatas? Somebody offered a korban chatas, and the kohen had applied one of the 4 applications of blood, and then the owner of the korban chatas died. So, do you apply the remaining 3? So the answer is yes, you do apply the remaining 3, because since the first one was already applied, and at that point, right, that's the required one. At that point, it's considered sheker kol matirav, technically speaking. So therefore, you can at this point apply the remaining 3. It would not be considered a chatas shemesu b'aleh, because since the owner was still alive at the time that the most important of the applications was applied. So that is the most important thing, and you can then continue and apply the rest of the applications of blood, the final 3. And additionally, if somebody were to apply these 3 applications on, let's say, a mizbeah, on, like, let's say a bama, right, a mizbeah outside of the azara, you would be chayiv for that. So again, even though these 3 are technically not needed, you would still be chayiv for applying this blood to right outside of the azar. So again, Rabbi Yochanan says, shalosh matanos shebechatos, regarding these 3 matanos, einan bos balayla, you can't apply them at night. Uvos lachar misa, you would apply them even if the owner died after the first application. V'amay lemein b'chutz chayiv, and also regarding these 3, if you apply them outside of the azar, you will be chayiv for that. Amar Papa, says Rav Papa, yeshmen kitchilaso v'yeshmen kisofo, says Rav Papa, that when it comes to these final 3 applications, there are some characteristics that are more similar to the first application, the required application, and there are other characteristics that are more similar to the shiyarei adam, the shiraim, the leftover blood that you spill on the Yisod Mizbech, right? So, as we learned about, I don't remember, maybe yesterday, the day before, that when it comes to a korban chatas, and I can't remember, I think maybe it was the day before. That when it comes to korbanis, so after the, let's say, zrika sadam, or in the case of a chatas, the matan damim, whatever blood is left in the klisharis, you spill on the yesod of the mizbeach, and after the applications have been done, whether zrika sadam, matan damim, so the blood that's left over, that you spill on the yesod of mizbeach is what's called shiraim. Okay, so with regard to these final 3 applications of the blood, in some ways they are similar to the first the required application of the blood. In other ways, they're more similar to the shiari adam, the leftover blood, the way that we treat the blood that's left over after the zrikas adam, after the matan damim. So again, Amar Papa says, Papa Yishmein kitchilaso, there are some characteristics of these final 3 applications of blood that are more similar to the first application of blood. Ve'eshman kisofo, there are other characteristics that are more similar to how we would treat the shiraim, the leftover blood post-application. Here we go. These are the ones that are similar to the first application of the blood. Chutz, you will be chayiv if you apply these 3 applications outside of the azar, just like the first application. V'layla, you can't apply them at night, right? These are things that Rabbi Yochanan had said. Zarus, a zar who applies these 3 applications of blood will be chayiv misa, just like a zar who does the avoda. Right, non-kohen. V'klei sharis, they gotta be in a service vessel. Keren ve'etzba, you apply these 3 to the horn, right, the top, to the top corner of the top corners of the mizbeach with your finger. Kibus, if the blood gets on the kohen's clothing, he has to wash his clothing, right? So if you have we're going to learn more about this soon, but if you have the kohen, he already applied the first matan damim, and now he's going to apply the next 3 and some of the blood, got on his clothing, right? The blood was in the klisharis. He was going to now apply it to the other three corners, and some of the blood got on his clothing. He would have to wash his clothing. V'shirayim, and as we learned about this scenario recently, that for example, if you have a korban chatas, that the blood was received in 4 different vessels, and the blood is applied to each of the corners of the mizbeach from each of the 4 respective vessels. So each of those 4 would be considered shiori adam, to be spilled out on the yesod of the mizbeach. Right, so we would treat each of those additional 3 corners in the same way that we treat the first corner, and therefore the vessels that each of the 4 corners came from, including those 3, would be spilled on the yesod of the mizbeach. Kitchilasin. So in all of those ways, the final 3 applications of a blood of a chatos are similar to the first one. Now, Misa, with regard to, as Rabbi Yochanan had said, being able to apply these 3 applications of blood even if the owner is already dead, right? The first application we would not apply if the owner died, but once the first application has been applied, if the owner dies, we would apply these final 3. Lo sharia, also these 3, these 3 don't permit the meat to be eaten, or the emurin to be burnt on the mizbech. That was the first application, right? Once the first application is applied, so then the meat can be eaten by the kohanim. The emurin can be burnt on the mizbech. These 3 aren't the ones responsible for permitting that. That would be the first one. Velo mifagla. Additionally, if there was a machshavas chutz lizmano by these 3, it would not be pigul, since again it's already mutter, right? Once the matirin of a korban are offered, i.e. the zrika sadam, so then, right, that is what would establish a korban to be pigul. Once the first application is applied, that is right, that stage is already done. Kilu, assuming that until that point the korban was kosher, so it's already a kosher korban, and the meat is mutter to the kohanim. The emurim can be burnt. If at this point, by the final 3 applications of the blood, the kohen had a machshov of chutz lizmano, it wouldn't make it pigul at that point. Velo ayla ligavoy, and similarly, also another example of kisofan, of what we're treated like shiraim, as we'll see in a second, is that when it comes to korban chatos, if the blood is brought into the heichel, so then the korban would be pasul. However, once the first application of the blood of the korban chatas has been applied to the mizbeach, well then, even if the remaining blood, even before the final 3 applications were applied, their blood goes into the heichel, the korban would not be pasul. It would still be kosher. Kisofan, in all of those ways, the final 3 applications of blood are more similar to the shirayim of the blood, right? The way that we relate to the blood after the matan damim. Okay, so Rav Papa just pointed out that in some ways there are some characteristics of these final 3 applications that in those ways they are similar to the required application of blood, the first of the matan damim, and in other ways they are similar to the shirayim, the leftover blood post application of blood. Amar Papa says, Rav Papa Minaminallah. So Rav Papa now is discussing one of the aspects of the first section, meaning one of the things that we talked about was that if some of the blood of the korban gets on the clothing of the kohen, he's going to have to wash his clothes. And on this, Rav Papa says, Minaminallah, how do I know that this is the case? That when it comes to korban chatas, and the kohen is applying the blood on the mizbech, he sticks his finger in the klisharis and applies the blood to one of the corners. Now he's got to apply it to the final 3, and at that point, some of the blood from the klisharis gets on the kohen's clothing. How do we know that he would have to wash his clothing? The Tanan, as we learn in the Mishnah, Nitos minat saver ala beged eino ton kibus. If after a kohen slaughters an animal, the blood squirts from the neck of the animal directly onto the clothing of the kohen. The kohen will not have to wash, is not required to wash his clothing from that. Okay, nitas minat saver ala beged. If blood squirted directly from the neck of the animal onto the clothing, eno ton kibus, he would not have to wash his clothing. Minakeren uminayisod. Similarly, if after the kohen dips his finger into the blood and then applies the blood to the mizbeach, the blood then splatters from the mizbeach onto his clothing, he would not have to wash his clothing. And also, if while pouring the shirayim on to the yesod of the mizbeach, it splattered on his clothing, also ein ton kibus, he would not have to wash his clothing. However, the implication being that which is fit for the corner of the mizbeach, for the horn of the mizbeach, ta'on kibus, would require washing the clothing. Right? Rav Papa points out, he's bringing this as a proof that the blood, in the context of the final three applications of the blood, if it gets on the kohen's clothing, he would have to wash his clothing. How do we know this? Because this Mishnah says that if the blood splatters onto the kohen's clothing after it has been applied to the keren hamizbeach, right? What did it say? It said min keren, right? From the keren of the mizbeach, from the horn of the mizbeach, meaning if after the kohen applied the blood to the horn of the mizbeach, it splattered on him, implying that min ha'ra'ui lekeren, but that which has not yet been applied to the keren of the mizbeach, i.e., these three applications of blood that have not yet been applied, meaning after they've been applied, if they splatter on the clothing of the kohen, he would not have to wash his clothing. But prior to being applied, even with regard to these final three applications of the blood, if the blood would get on the clothing of the kohen, he would have to wash his clothing. So therefore, Rav Papa wants to argue that this is a proof, a support, that if the blood of the final three applications splatters onto the clothing of the kohen prior to applying it to the mizbeach, he will have to wash his clothing. In fact, the Gemara uletaimech. But one second, if you want to be medayik like that and say, well, since it says from the corner, implying that before being applied to the right ra'ui lekeren, that if it has not yet been applied but is fit to be applied, he would have to wash his clothing, right? Meaning from the right post application to the corner, he wouldn't have to wash his clothing, but prior, he would have to wash his clothing. But if that's the case, min hayesod ein ton kibus. The Mishnah had also said that if when pouring the blood on the yesod of the mizbeach, it splatters on the kohen's clothing, he would not have to wash his clothing. Well, then we should make the same deal. Min ha'ra'ui liyesod ton kibus. So does that imply then that the blood that is fit to be poured on the yesod, if it's splattered on his clothing, he would have to wash his clothing? Chevit, what's the problem with that argument? The problem is what's the blood that is ra'ui to be poured on the yesod of the mizbeach? Shirayim, post-application blood. And we had just said, or even better yet, Asher Yizeh Ksiv, the pasuk says, Asher Yizeh, that which will be sprinkled, Prat Lezeh Shekvar Huza, to the exception of this that was already applied. I.e., right, as we had said earlier, right, Min ha'ra'ui lekeren, that which is fit to be applied to the horn prior to being applied to the keren of the mizbeach. If it gets on the clothing of the kohen, he's going to have to wash his clothing. But once it's been applied to the Karen of the Mizbeach, if it spritzes on his clothing, he won't have to wash his clothing. And once all of the applications have been applied, and now you have this shirayim of the blood that needs to be poured on the yisod of the mizbech, of course, he will not have to wash his clothing. So again, if we want to be midayek, that when it says in the Mishnah that the blood, once it's applied to the corner, if it gets on his clothing, he doesn't have to wash it, implying that min ra'ui for the keren, i.e. the shalosh achronos, he would have to wash his clothing. But then that would imply that when the Mishnah says that the blood that splatters when pouring it on the yesod, he doesn't have to wash his clothing, does that imply that, however, the blood that is fit to be poured, i.e. the shirayim, if it gets on his clothes, he would have to wash his clothing? But of course not. Rather, says the Gemara, Rav Papa, this Mishnah is no proof, because Amani Reb Nechemya, this Brisa this Mishnah is specifically the opinion of Reb Nechemya. The Chacham argue on him. This is the opinion of Reb Nechemya. It's not that we learn in the Mishnah. Reb Nechemya, Omer says, Reb Nechemya, Shiyari Adam Shekrivan Bachutz Chayev. That when it comes to the Shiyari Adam, the leftover blood, the blood that's left over after the applications of the blood on the Mizbeach, if that leftover blood is offered, I assume it means that it's applied on the Mizbeach somewhere else, outside of the Azara, you're going to be chayev for that. And therefore, right, that's the opinion of Reb Nechemya. And therefore, we want to assume that just like Reb Nechemya would say that you'd be a chayev for applying that blood, also if it got on your clothing, you would have to wash it. And therefore, this Mishnah, which is implying that the shirayim, if it got in your clothing, you'd have to wash it, is davka, the opinion of Nechemya. So, Rav Papa, you're saying that, wow, we have a great proof from this Mishnah. This Mishnah is just the opinion of Nechemya. The Chachamim would argue on him. To which the Gemara says, how are you so sure that this Mishnah is the opinion of Reb Nechemya? Look, we know that Reb Nechemya says that, sure, when it comes to the shirayim, if you offer them outside of the Azara, you're going to be chayiv. But how do you know that means that he would also have to wash his clothes if it got on his clothes? I'll say that, look, Reb Nechemya says that once the blood has been applied, the shirayim, the leftovers, if they are offered outside of the Azor, you can be chayiv, just like if you offer the emurim, the evarim, the pedarim, the emurim outside of the Azor, you'd be chayiv also, even though we were already post the application of the blood. You'd be chayiv for offering the emurim outside of the Azor. You'd also be chayiv for offering the blood outside of the Azar. However, Linyan Kibus Mishamsle, how do we know that Rabbi Nechemya would say that you would also have to, the kohen would have to wash his clothes if it got on his clothing? Yes, he does say that. How do we know? V'atani is we learn in the Brisa. Domim hatunin yisod tunin kibus umachshav b'maylos ben v'amayl ben b'chutz chayib. So dom matun yisod. So the assumption for now is, what does it mean dom matun yisod? Shirayim. You have a korban chatas. The blood has already been applied, and the blood that is left over needs to now be spilled, be poured on the yisod of the mizbeach. So dom matun yisod, that the blood that's post application, that's left over, the shirayim that needs to be poured on the yisod of the mizbeach. Te'unin kibus, if they get on the clothing of the kohen, he would have to wash his clothing. And also, regarding this blood, if the kohen is a machshava of pigul chutz lezmano, let's say tit the korban chutz lezmano, it'll be pigul. V'amayla mein bachutz chayav, and somebody who offers them outside of the azar would be chayiv. Continues the brisa. V'dam manishpachim la'ama, blood that is puzzle, right? Not just that it's already been applied, but it literally became puzzle, that you have to spill down the stream that runs through the Azara, that it'll be taken out to the Nachal Kidron. So ein tu'unin kibus. So regarding puzzle blood, if it got on one's clothing, right? It's all of these. This is going to be important for later, but basically all of these are the exact opposite of the first scenarios. Ein tu'unin kibus. If the blood gets on the kohen's clothing, when we're talking about puzzle blood, he wouldn't have to wash his clothing. Regarding this puzzle blood, if there was a machshavas pigul of chutz lizmano, it would not be pigul. Potter. And finally, somebody who would offer them outside of the azar, potter. So in all of these scenarios, by puzzle blood, basically in all the cases which by the shiraim you would be chayiv, by the puzzle blood you would be potter. Now, when it came to the shiraim, we had said that if they're offered outside of the azar, you would be chayiv. Man shamas le'da'am man b'chutz chayiv. Whose opinion is it that the shiraim, if offered outside of the azar, you'd be chayiv? As we know from earlier, Reb Nechemia. It's the opinion of Reb Nechemia. It's the opinion of Reb Nechemia. V'kamer ton kibus. And in that same brisa, where we had just said that by the shiraim, if they're offered outside of the azara, you're going to be chayiv. It also says that if they get on the clothing of the kohen, he's going to have to wash his clothing. So we see that yes, Reb Nechemia also holds, with regard to shirayim, that if he gets on the kohen's clothes, he's going to have to wash his clothes, and therefore that Mishnah from earlier is, as we had said earlier, is nafka the opinion of Reb Nechemia. And that also it would be pigul by the shirayim. Now, if he has machshavas chutz zmanu. Ve'atanya, but we learn in a brisa. One second. Ve'atanya, but we learn in a brisa. Yatsu shirayim, that when it comes to shirayim, ve'aktoras emurim, and the burning of the emurim, she'ein ma'akvin kapara, that they are not ma'akiv the kapara, i.e. the kapara at that point has already been done, the blood has already been applied. She'ein machshav moel izboin. That the machshava, when it comes to shirayim, there's no machsheves pigul. So how can we be saying that brisa is talking about shirayim? How can we say that brisa is talking about shirayim and also saying that there's pigul? But I thought that there is no pit. Once already, the blood has been applied to the mizbeach. Any machshava of chutz lizmanu is not going to be pigul anymore. So rather, kitanya hayi b'shalish matonis shebechatos. So rather, that brisa at the top, where it's talking about, right, the dam matnun yisod, all the way at the top of the amud, right, tunin kibus umachshav moeles ben v'mayel ben b'chutz chayiv. That brisa from the top that I wanted to say is Reb Nechemia. It's not talking about shirayim. It's talking about the final three applications of the blood. If that's the case, tunin yisod lekeren asle. But then why are we referring to this blood as blood that needs to be poured on the yisod of the mizbeach? This is blood. If we're talking about the three final applications of the dam chatas, that's not on the yisod of the mizbeach. That's on the kainos of mizbeach, the top of the mizbeach. So it meant nitonin yisod. It means that eventually they will need to be poured. The shirayim is eventually going to have to be poured on the yisod. Okay. But 1 second. But we had also said there that machshavas chutz lizmano would be pigul. Machshavas chutz lizmano would be pigul, but that's not the case by the shalosh matanos achronos. we had said earlier, again, lo sharia, that the shalosh matanos achronos aren't going to be matir the korban, because that was already mutter. It was already mutter from the first application. V'lo mefagla. And any machshava of chutz lizmanu would not be pigol when it comes to the shalosh matanos achronos. V'lo ad legavai, and also if the blood is brought into the heichal, it will not make the korban pasul, because often like the shirayim itself. So how could we be saying that brayso at the top of the Amud is talking about shirayim elo kitanya b'damim apnimim? Interesting. Okay, so look. In fact, that brayso at the top of the Amud is talking about shirayim, which is why we're talking about pouring them on the yisod of the mizbeach. However, but we're talking about the shirayim of a chatas apnimi, a korban whose blood was already sprinkled was already applied to mizbeach apnimi in the heichal, and now you have the leftover blood that needs to be poured on the yesod of the mizbeach hachitzon. And it is that blood by chatas apnimis that we're talking about, that all of these things would apply to. That if you have machshavas chutz lizmanu, it would be pigul by the shirayim of a chatas apnimi. If you apply them, offer the blood chutz lizmanu, right outside of the azara, if it gets on the clothing of the kohen, you'd have to wash his clothing. That is what we're talking about. We're talking about the shirayim of a chatas apnimis, not a chatas achitzonis. Okay, but then, okay, so 1 second. So you're telling me that the reason why all these things apply, pigul applies, he has to wash his clothing, you'd be chai for applying the blood b'chutz. So that's because, specifically you're saying, because it's achatas apnimis. Aval b'damim achitzonim mai potter. Okay, so that would mean that what? That the shirayim of a chatas achitzonis, then you're saying, would be potter, right? Kind of as we said before, right? That like any machshavas chutz lizmanu by the shirayim of a chatas achitzonis would not be pigul, right? But adatoni domim aneshpachin la'ama liflog v'lesne b'didei b'amid dvarim amurim b'damim apnimim ava b'damim achitzonim potter. Chaver, who wants to explain that? What the Gemara is saying is that, look, if we look at that brayso, right, the brayso all the way at the top of Lamed Tes Amud Aleph, I think maybe it would be helpful if we just actually read that brayso. Let's go back to the top of the Amud and actually quickly read through that brayso. So when it comes to the shirayim, so we said, Tu'unin kibus, umachshav u'meles boen, v'mayla ben bachutz, chayav, right? In these three scenarios, essentially, chayav, when it comes to the shirayim. And then we say, but when we're talking about pasul blood, in those same three scenarios, potter. Ein tu'unin kibus, ve'ein machshav u'meles ben, v'mayla bachutz, potter. So in that brayso, we make a binary, a black and white distinction. When it comes to shirayim, in all three of the cases listed, chayiv. When it comes to pasul blood, in all three cases, potter. But if we're saying that the reisha by the shirayim is specifically the shirayim of mizbeach of chatas apnimis, and that's why you're chayiv, implying, and we want, right, the implication being that if it was the shirayim of chatas achitzonis, you would be potter, just like you're potter by the pasul blood. Well, then we should have that distinction as well, right? Just like we're making the distinction between the shirayim and the pasul blood, that you're chayiv in all the cases by shirayim, you're pasul in all the cases by the pasul blood. We should further distinguish and say that even when it comes to the shirayim, you're only chayiv if you're talking about shirayim of a chatas apnimis, but you'd be potter if we're talking about a chatas achitzonis. Right? So again, I'm backing up a few lines. Potter. Well, you're telling me that you're only chayev for these things because we're talking about the shirayim of a chatas apnimis, but that if we're talking about a chatas achitzonis, you would be potter. Adatani dam man ishpachin la'ama Well, then, if that brisa is saying, in what scenario are you potter? If we're talking about puzzle blood that is spilled out into the stream in the Azara, well then, liflog v'lesnim bedida, we should say, wait, we should further distinguish and say that even in the Reisha, by the Shiraim, when we say chayav, we should say, well, actually, when is this so? B'dam pnimim. If we're talking about a chatas apnimis, the Shiraim of a chatas apnimis, aval b'dam machitzonim, if we're talking about the Shiraim of a chatas achitzonis, potter, you'd be potter just like by the puzzle blood. Says the Gemara, look, we can't actually look. The Reisha the Reisha of the Brisa is talking about chatas apnimis. The reason why we can't make your suggested edit to say to further distinguish that you're only chayiv because chatas apnimis, but by chatas achitzonis you be potter because Hamani Reb Nechemia. This Brisa is the opinion of Reb Nechemia. Damer Shari Adam Shekriv Machutz Chayav. Because Reb Nechemia actually says that even when it comes to the shiraim of a chatas chitzonis, you would be chayav for offering the blood outside of the azara, and therefore it's not a clean it's not a binary anymore. V'lo masni le tlasa p'turei levade tlasa chiyuve. You wouldn't be able to have that clean distinction anymore, right? In the Brisa, as it is, there's a clean distinction. We gave 3 scenarios. By the Shiraim of Achatas HaPnimis, you're Chayiv in all 3 scenarios. By Puzzle Blood, you're Potter in all 3 scenarios. If we're going to distinguish by Shiraim and say that you're only Chayiv by Chatas HaPnimis, but by Chatas HaChitonis you'll be Potter, that's not entirely true. It becomes complicated because actually even by the Chatas HaChitonis, you're only Potter for 2 out of 3. You still be chayav, since it's the opinion of Reb Nechemia, you'd still be chayav for offering the blood outside of the azar. And therefore, because the distinction gets a little bit more complicated when it comes to the chatas chitzonis, it is left out. However, the way to understand that brisa is that the Reisha is talking about a chatas apnimis, the Sefer is talking about puzzle blood, and yes, when it comes to chatas chitzonis, you would be potter right, when it comes to washing the clothing. The kohen would not have to wash his clothing. Also, in terms of pigul, there would be no machshavas pigul. However, you would be chayav for offering the blood outside of the Zara, since the author of the Brisa is Reb Nechemia. Ravina Omar says Ravina. So Ravina actually comes with an interesting edit. Ravina comes with an interesting edit. His edit is that we had quoted a Mishnah earlier. I'm going to actually read that Mishnah. Right? This Mishnah was brought by Rav Papa as his initial proof to say that the final 3 applications of blood, if they get on the clothing of the kohen, he's going to have to wash his clothing. And he brought his proof from the following Mishnah that I'm backing up to Daf Lamed Chesem at Beis, about 10 lines from the bottom. It said, Nitas min hatzavra al abeged ein ton kibus, min hakeren u'min ha'yesod ein ton kibus. That the Mishnah had said that if the blood splatters on the clothing of the kohen from the corner of the mizbeach, or from the yesod of the mizbeach, ein ton kibus. So the kohen does not need to wash his clothing. And Rav Papa implied, but ra'ui lekeren, that which hasn't yet been applied to the corner of the mizbeach, but that is fit to be applied to the corner of the mizbeach, i.e., even the final 3 applications of blood that have not yet been applied to the keren, if they get on your clothing, if they get on the clothing of the kohen, he's going to have to wash it. But then we ask the question, but 1 second, it also says that blood, that splattering of the shiraim that's being poured, right, that was poured on the yesod and splattered off of the yesod on the clothing doesn't need to be, the kohen doesn't have to wash his clothing. Is that to imply that the shiraim themselves, if the shiraim get on the clothing of the kohen, he would have to wash his clothing? But we said that that's not the case, though. So therefore, so the point being that based on the way that the Mishnah is written, that if the blood gets on the clothing from after it was applied on the corners of his mizbeach, or from after it was applied on the yesod, so from there we implied that only from the corner he would not have to wash his clothing, but from the blood that is fit to be put on the corner, i.e. from the shalosh matonos achronos, he would have to wash his clothing. But then we ask the question but then that implies also that from the yesod, from splatters from the yesod, he wouldn't have to wash his clothing, implying that the shirayim prior to being poured on the yesod, if it got in his clothing, he would have to wash his clothing. But we said, but that's not the case. Says Ravina, right? And then that was basically, we got into this whole quagmire that, well, maybe it's Reb Nechemya, and actually it's not actually a good proof. Comes Ravina to say, actually it could be a good proof, because Ravina, Minakeren Mamish, that when the Mishnah says that if the blood gets on the clothing of the kohen, once it's been applied to the keren of the mizbeach, he doesn't have to wash his clothing, implying that mina ro'ui lekeren, i.e. the shalosh matonos achronos, he would have to wash his clothing. Okay, fine. But mina yesod, mina ro'ui liyesod. But, says Ravina, when the Mishnah says that if the blood splatters on the clothing of the kohen from the yesod, it doesn't mean from the yesod directly. It means mina ra'ui liyesod. The Mishnah is saying that the shirayim, if the shirayim gets on the clothing of the kohen, he does not need to wash his clothing. It's not that if it splatters from the yesod, implying, and then the Gemara had asked, is that to imply that the shirayim, if it gets on the clothes, he would have to wash his clothing? No. What the Mishnah is saying is that if the shirayim, mina ro'ili, so that which is fit to be poured on the shirayim, if that gets on the clothing of the kohen, he would not have to wash his clothing. That's what the Mishnah is saying. Again, Ravina Omer says, Ravina mina keren mamish, that when it says mina keren, if the blood gets on the clothing of the kohen after it's been applied on the keren of the mizbeach, that's correct, implying that mina ro'ili keren, he would have to wash his clothing. But mina yesod, when it says from the yesod, it doesn't mean that it's splattered on his clothing while he was pouring it on the yesod. Rather, mina ro'ili yesod. It means that the shirayim, that which is fit to be poured on the yesod. All my lay, Rav Tachlifa bar Gozel Ravina, says Rav Tachlifa bar Gozel to Ravina, Ema idi ve'idi ra'uihu. Rav Tachlifa bar Gozel suggests that, wait, maybe both are ra'ui. Maybe what it's saying is that even the shalosh matonos achronos, those that are fit to be applied to the corner of the mizbeach, if they get on the clothing of the kohen, he would not have to wash his clothing, as well as the shirayim, which are ra'ui for the yesod. Right? Maybe both are ra'ui. Maybe it's saying that the blood of the shalosh matonos achronos that are ra'ui for the keren, as well as the shirayim that are ra'ui for the yesod. In either case, if it got on the clothing of the kohen, he would not have to wash his clothing. So, that can't be, because ashter ra'ui lekeren Omart lo, because if that's the case, and we're saying that by the shalosh matonos achronos already, that haven't even been applied yet to the corners of the mizbeach, if they got on the clothing of the kohen, he would not have to wash his clothing. Well then, obviously, ro'ui liyesod mibaya, obviously the shirayim, which are even after the blood has been applied to the corners, obviously he wouldn't have to wash his clothing. So ela min hakeren mamish, rather, when it says mina keren, it literally means blood that has splattered from the corner of the mizbeach. The kohen would not have to wash his clothing, but that which is fit to be applied to the keren mizbeach, i.e. the shalosh matonos achronos. I'm sorry, I don't know what I just said, but if it has already been applied to the corner, the kohen would not have to wash his clothing. If it's ro'ui to be applied to the corner, i.e. the shalosh matonos achronos, he would have to wash his clothing. And the shirayim that are ro'ui to be poured on the yesod, if they got on his clothing, the kohen's clothing, he would not have to wash his clothing. And there goes the question that we had asked from before, because that assumed that it was talking about the yesod itself, implying that the shirayim, he would have to wash his clothing, and then that asks the whole question, Reb Nechemia, that whole thing. But according to Ravina, no, it's that which is fit to be poured in the yesod, i.e. the shirayim would not have to wash his clothing. And now for the final section of today's daf, the blood of an internal chatas, the blood of a chatas pnimis. Now the blood of a chatas pnimis, all 4 applications of the blood on the mizbeach pnimi, you must do. This is not like the chatas chitzon where you only have to do 1, or according to Beis Shammai 2. By chatas pnimis you have to do all 4. So kanitana mizbeach pnimi v'chulei tanu rabbanan the Rebbe taught. The also kasher also. This posik is a posik by a par helem dover shel tzibur. Friends, remember Masechta Horius. So in the 4th parak of Sefer Vayikra, the first topic discussed there is par kohen Mashiach. When a kohen gadol essentially makes a mistake, without going into the details, very similar to Parlam Davar Shel Tzibur, but for a kohen gadol, paskins for himself incorrectly. And then the next topic in the 4th parak of Sefer Vayikra is par helem davar shel tzibur. Of course, when the Sanhedrin ruled mistakenly about something that you bichayev al shigigaso al zdono karis val shigigaso chatas, and then the congregation did based on their ruling, and then you bring this chatas apnimis, what's called the parlam davar shel tzibur, and it says by the parlam davar shel tzibur also kasher also that you do to the parlam davar shel tzibur just like you had done for the previous scenario, i.e., just like you had done by the par kohen Mashiach. Mabal lelamid. What is it coming to teach us? Because if you look in the Psukim, Sefer Vayikra, in the 4th parak of Sefer Vayikra, so it talks about the par kohen Mashiach, and then it talks about the par helem davar shel tzibur. And it doesn't just say, check out what it says, check out what I wrote by the par kohen Mashiach. It doesn't say that. It lists everything you have to do for a par helem davar shel tzibur, and then it says v'asa kasher. So what's it saying? And you'll do like you did by the par kohen Mashiach. What halachas did the Torah not already tell us by the par helem davar shel tzibur that it needs to say, okay, go reference the par kohen Mashiach and see what we did over there and do the same thing here. What is this thing? Also kasher also, you'll do like you did by the par kohen Mashiach. What is this thing that we're going to do like we did by the par kohen Mashiach? Lichpol badza also. The point is that it's coming to reiterate the zrikas hadams. That just like we explain, right? Yes, the Torah told us that there's zrikas hadam by the par kohen Mashiach, and yes, the Torah told us that there's zrikas hadam by the par helem davar shel tzibur. However, v'asa kasher also is to double down on the zrikas hadam. V'lomed shem chiser achas to teach that if you neglected to even do one of the zrikas adams, then the korban is posel. You must do all of the zrikas adams. And the elamatan sheva shema'akvos b'chol makom. Okay, but says the Gemara, wait, but all I'll say is that just the matnos sheva, right? That you that by a chatas apnimis you sprinkle, I think 7 times towards the paroches. Now that is something that is always going to be, you're always going to have to do all of them in the cases of chatas apnimius. So matan daled minayin. How do I know though that the application of 4 on the mizbeach itself by chatas apnimis? How do I know that that's also makiv? Because after all, when it comes to chatas chitzonis, this is something. I mean, if we're saying that the azah is sheva, right, by chatas apnimis, but also, as we're going to learn tomorrow, also by para aduma and by the log of mitzora. So these things are ma'akeh. But when it comes to the application of the blood on the corner on the karnos hamizbeach, Well, actually, when it comes to a chatas achitzonis, it isn't ma'akev. So when it comes to the 7 azos, yeah, these are things that wherever they come up, that you have to do all of them. But that's not the case by the 4 applications of blood of a korban chatas, because by chatas achitzonis, it's not ma'akev. You don't have to do all 4. So Talmud Omar, so therefore the pasuk says Kain Yaise. Therefore it says Kain Yaise. So will you do, to imply, or Kain Yaise. Fine. So will you do here as well, to imply, to double down on for the applications of the 4 applications of blood of the mizbeach apnimi, to say that those are also ma'akev lapar zepar yom kippurim. When we say lapar, that is coming to include even the par of Yom Kippur, to include that the par of Yom Kippur and the halachas of par and davar shel tzibur. Kasher also lapar zepar kohen Mashiach. When it says kasher also lapar, that par is also talking about now kohen Mashiach. So basically, we're bringing into these halachas, obviously the par hel and davar shel tzibur that it's talking about, but also we're pulling into these halachas the par of Yom Kippur, the par kohen Mashiach. When the pasuk says chatas elu seirei avodas kochavim, that's also talking about the goats of avodas kochavim. That if the majority of Am, right, that if Am Yisrael worshipped avodah zarah, right, basically like a parim davar shel tzibur, but in the context of avodah zarah, so that's also going to be offered inside the heichal, and there's going to be the sprinkling towards the paroches and the mizbeach achitzon. So it's coming to include the sirei avodas kochavim and all these halachas. Yochel shanimar ba'av sirei regalim v'sirei rosh chodashim. It's possible that I'll also say that the same applies also to the goats offered on the festivals, on the shalosh regalim, as well as on Rosh Chodesh, that they also have to be offered inside the heichal, etc. So Talmud Lomar lo, the pasuk says to exclude the Seirei Regalim and Rosh Chodashim. Umara Isa l'Rabbas Aselu lo tzeiaselu. How come we're including the Sa'ir Avodas Kochavim and excluding the Seirei Regalim and Seirei Rosh Chodashim? Well, Achar Shariba Kosav Umiyet. Well, because the pasuk is including different korbanos and also excluding other korbanos. So Marbe Ani Es Elu. So if I have to choose what's being included and what's being excluded, I'll include the Seirei Avodah Zarah Shemechapin Al Averas Mitzvah Yedua, because a Seir Avodah Zarah is being mechaper on an Avera that we know about it. It's the Avera of Avodah Zarah. Umotzani Es Elu. But when it comes to the Seirei Regalim, for example, as we learned in the first Mishnah of Masechta Shavuos, that is mechaper for Tumas Mikdash v'Kodashav when there was no Yediyah, whether Batchila or Basof, i.e., she'ein mechaper al averas mitzvah yedua, that the Seirei Regalim is being mechaper for Tumas Mikdash v'Kodashav when you have no knowledge that you went into the Beis HaMikdash when you were tummy, for example. So therefore, we're saying that we're going to include a korban where we know what the Avera is, what it's being brought for, and we'll exclude a korban where it's talking about when you don't know that you actually even did the Avera. V'chiper, when the pasuk says v'chiper, and it will atone af al pi shelo samach, even though no smicha was done, no leaning on the korban was done, v'nislach, there will be atonement, forgiveness, af al pi shelo nosan shirayim, even though the shirayim was not spilled on the yesod of the mizbeach. Ra'isa lifsol ba'zaos ulachsha b'smicha v'shirayim. How come we're saying that if you don't do all of this, the blood work that you need to do, the animal's puzzle, and yet if you don't do smicha, or if you don't pour the shirayim on the yesod, it's kosher? Well, Omar posel ba'zaos shema'akvos b'chol makom. Well, we'll say that will be posel, will invalidate the korban by the sprinkling of the blood, because the sprinkling of the blood is ma'akev in all these scenarios, as we'll get to at the very beginning of tomorrow's daf, specifically the 7 applications of the sprinkling of the blood, or the sprinkling of the blood or the oil of the metzora. As opposed to smicha and shirayim, which in other scenarios are not going to be ma'akiv, even if you don't do smicha, or if you don't do pour the shirayim on the yesod, the korban is still kosher. So therefore, I'll say the same thing by the parlim davar shel tzibor as well. Chevre, that was Daf Lamed Tes of Masechta Zevachim. And Daf Lamed Tes of Masechta Zevachim, the first section of the daf, we discussed the final 3 blood applications of a korban chatas, right? Because as we know, really only the first one is the one that needs to be done. The final 3, how do we relate to them? So in some ways they are similar to the first one that has to be done, and the same halachas by the first one would apply to the final 3. But in other ways they are, without going into all of the specific ones because there were a bunch of them, but in other ways they are also like the shirayim, the leftover blood that needs to be poured on the yesod of the mizbeach. We then discussed sacrifice blood that gets on a kohen's clothing. So, do not wash the clothes when it squirts directly from the animal's neck. Do not wash the clothes once the blood has been applied to the mizbeach and it just kind of splatters on his clothing from the corner of the mizbeach. Do not wash the clothes for leftovers, right? If the shirayim gets on his clothes, or if it splatters when pouring it on the yesod. Do wash the clothes when the blood splatters from the vessel prior to application of the mizbeach, right? Meaning, as we had said, by the shalosh matanos, by achronos, by this blood that is ra'ui to be applied to the corners of the mizbeach. If that blood, even if it's by the shalosh matanos achronos, if it gets on the clothing of the kohen, he will have to wash his clothing. And finally, the blood of a chatas apnimis, all applications must be applied to the mizbeach apnimi, to the inner altar. Friends, that was Daf Lamed Tes of Masechta Zevachim. Hope you enjoyed. Cheers.